Is out. It's going to warm up and feel like Austin, Texas again. Yay. I'm Judy Maggio with KLRU's Decibel, and we want to thank everybody for getting up early and joining us and giving us your time. I know it's sometimes hard to trek down here first thing in the morning, and we appreciate you caring enough about your community to be here. I first want to introduce Sly Majid from the Leadership Austin Board of Directors to welcome everybody.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Let's try that again. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
My name is Sly Majid. I'm a member of the Leadership Austin Board of Directors. I want to thank you all for being here at this morning's Engage Breakfast. I know it was a chilly morning and probably a little bit hard to get out of bed, but today's topic is very important. We're very thankful that you're here. I just want to have a couple notes about this morning's event. As we gather this morning, let us remind us that our goals for these breakfasts are pretty simple. There are three things that we want you to do to get out of this. One is to be informed, share information about a community issue, engage in understanding different perspectives, hear a perspective that may be different than yours, and then act. We each leave the room and act, and maybe as simple as sharing what resonated with you, with your family, your friends, your coworkers, or finding a calling and a specific action that you will take part in the community. Obviously, these breakfasts and the work of Leadership Austin could not be possible without the support of our sponsors, so we want to thank them. Many of our sponsors are listed on the screens, and we just really want to acknowledge their ongoing support and appreciate their work. A few that we want to acknowledge specifically this morning. We want to acknowledge the Indian American Coalition of Texas, who bought 2 tables and are here today, so let's give them a round of applause. They're a nonprofit focused on civic and political engagement within the South Asian community and everyone in Central Texas. And then always we want to thank our presenting sponsor, the Austin Board of Realtors. And to help with a welcome, let's welcome Jenny Williams.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jenny Williams. I'm with the Austin Board of Realtors. I work in government and political affairs there. So this breakfast specifically is super right up my own personal alley. I love hearing about elections and all of that. But my work at the Austin Board of Realtors involves more than just that. We have 13,000 plus members across all of Central Texas. And what happens at City Hall, what happens at the State House, and what happens in Washington, D.C. impacts their lives on a daily basis. It impacts the lives of their clients, those who they help buy and sell homes, and it impacts just the community at large. And so that's why we feel like it's so important to be civically engaged as an organization, to play a part in elections and influence those and encourage our members to get out and vote and make sure their voices are heard. So without further ado, let's get into the panel.
Thank you so much, Jenny, and thank you for ABOR sponsorship, making these breakfasts possible. I'm excited about today's panel, too, because I am a political junkie just like you, Jenny, and there's so many different takeaways we can take a deep dive on from this election. I want to say a few words about live streaming. Our goal at Decibel, and we're KLRU's news division, is to cover issues that really matter to the community, and that's why this partnership with Leadership Austin works so well, because we're often covering the very same issues and topics impacting the community. We are live streaming, so if everybody wants to turn around and say good morning to the good morning everybody watching on Facebook. If you want to share this with your friends, we know everybody can't get to Leadership Austin's breakfast. The Facebook page is Decibel ATX. We also want to do a special shout out to the Leadership Austin 2019 Essential Class, the best class ever. And I understand they're watching one of their own on the panel this morning.
That's me.
Oh, Ed Espinosa is in the 2019 class. Is it the best class ever?
It's much better than the 2018 class.
Okay, that's what I heard.
Is that the one you were in, Matt?
2016.
Okay, that's what I meant.
Every
2016.
class is the best class ever. I guess those of you who aren't in Leadership Austin don't know the joke, but yes, every class is the best class ever. Also, if you want to text in a question, look at your big screen there, and you can text 22333. And I first want to introduce Courtney Bailey down here on the end. Courtney is the Director of Issues and Engagement for Leadership Austin, and she's going to try to find some common themes in the audience and pose those questions to our esteemed panel this morning. Now, I am guessing that most of you in this room voted in the 2018 midterm elections. Turnout incredibly high for a midterm. I think I read that it was the highest percentage of turnout for a midterm since 1970. So I applaud everybody in the room for making your voice heard and making your ballot count. This morning we want to zero in, though, on some of the trends, the takeaways, and really what it means down the road for our political future in the United States of America. We have a great panel that has some wonderful insight from different perspectives this morning. We first want to introduce Ed Espinosa. Now, Ed leads Progress Texas. This is a nonprofit media organization seeking to tell the progressive side of the story in Texas politics and public affairs. In this role, he works closely with the media, participates in 3 on-air TV news segments each week, and works with nonprofits and grassroots groups around the state to help them tell their stories to the public. Then we have Victoria DeFrancesco Soto. She is a lecturer at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at UT. She's also a faculty affiliate of the Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies and the Center for Mexican American Studies. Victoria's areas of expertise are perfect for this morning. They include immigration, Latinos, women, politics, political psychology, campaigns, and elections. She's also a contributor to MSNBC and NBCnews.com, as well as a political analyst for Telemundo. Then we have Matt Makoviak. Makoviak. Did I say it right?
Yes.
Makoviak. I've said it a million times. I knew I was going to mess it up this morning, though. Matt is an Austin and Washington, D.C. political communications consultant and president of Potomac Strategies Group, which provides political consulting to conservative campaigns and media relations and crisis communications assistance to companies, groups, and individuals. Now, Matt also serves as the Travis County Republican Party chair. He is the director of the Center for Public Policy and Political Studies at Austin Community College. So we have a great panel this morning. We're so glad you're here. Thank you for spending your time with us this morning. The first question I have is just a general perspective, takeaways from the 2018 midterms, and I'm going to start with you, Ed.
Well, I think the big takeaway from this midterm is that you really saw the world turned upside down in 2016. And while we talk about 2018 as a wave, I really think that 2018 was a market correction to something that had skewed not just far right in 2016, but just far into an area that many of us were not familiar with, including those on the right. So you've had a lot of that was manifested by putting Democrats into power, sweeping more Democrats into office around the country. But beyond that, what you saw, I want to say this on both sides, you saw more people taking democracy into their own hands in 2018. You saw more people running for local office, legislative office, congressional office, not really, without any real regard to district lines or gerrymandering or anything like that, or whatever the odds were. And that created a new landscape in 2018, a midterm landscape that we haven't seen in quite a long time. So my immediate takeaway is that it was as much a market correction as it was a wave.
Victoria?
Thank you. So I think 2 observations. The first is that everybody won. And that has to do with the fact that we had such high turnout. Midterm elections are notorious for low turnout. It's the, yeah, whatever, I'll vote in the presidential race. But here we saw folks across the board, folks who usually vote, kept on voting, and then you had African Americans and Latinos and young folks really step it up. And my hope is that we continue to see this, because if there's one thing we know from research is once you vote, you're more likely to keep on voting. So for me, that was a big win. My second observation is me wearing my political psychologist hat, and it was that anxiety has seemed to reach a ceiling. So one of the truisms of politics is that anxiety works, fear. There's a reason why we see so many negative ads, because psychologically the way we process it is we want to act. But there does get a point where so much anxiety is foisted upon folks where they start to recoil. And I think we saw that in this 2018 midterm election. It still worked for some elements, but for a broader section of the electorate, anxiety can't be sustained for such long periods of time. So those are my 2 takeaways.
Matt, general takeaways.
Yeah, I'd say 2 things. I'd say probably from the Republican perspective. I think the first is, the suburbs are moving away from the Republican Party in ways that that my party needs to really take seriously. You saw the kind of first stage of that in 2016. look certainly at Harris County, but also in the surrounding counties, really around the country. But it really took a totally different, deeper level, went to a deeper level here in 2018. Republicans lost congressional seats in suburban areas all over the country. It wasn't just in places like Northern Virginia where it was, fairly good guess that was going to happen, but it happened in Kansas City, it happened in Salt Lake City, Dallas, Houston. You can really almost name any major metro area, and Republicans lost a congressional seat. So why is that happening? I would say the best answer I have is that college-educated white women who are disproportionately located in suburban areas are fleeing the Republican Party right now. And that's something I think we've got to take very seriously, look at very carefully, and think about for the future, because if we're going to be a party that only represents the rural areas, we're not going to be a majority party for very long at all. The second thing is Republicans have got to develop a coherent position on health care. We spent the Obama years against Obamacare, and that was actually politically advantageous in 2010 and 2014. We took 40 or 50 votes against Obamacare to repeal it. Those were messaging votes. The president was never going to sign that legislation. We never did the hard work of building consensus behind what we wanted to proactively do on health care. And so because Trump's election was a surprise, even to many high-level Republicans, we still didn't have really a health care proposal. And so when they had to put one together to try to deliver on the promise of repealing or replacing Obamacare, it was a mess. Took 2 tries in the House. They made 2 tries in the Senate, came up 1 vote short. And it gave Democrats a very useful weapon to use against our side on pre-existing conditions. And if you look at this midterm, I think a lot of issues played into it, but certainly health care, I think even Democrats would admit, was their single most effective issue. And so I think my 2 takeaways are those 2 things. If you look at the election results, it was a split decision. Republicans gained at least 1, maybe 2 seats in the Senate, depending on what happens in Florida. Democrats gained, it looks like, about 38 seats in the House and took the majority back. Look, I felt better about election night, Tuesday night, nationally than I do now. The Senate map looked like 54 Republicans. Now it looks like 52 at best. Looked like 25, 26 House seats for the Democrats. Now it looks like 38. And so they're going to have a working majority with the Democrats in the House. And the next 2 years, we're going to have divided government. And my guess is we're not going to see very much get done.
So let's talk about where both parties need to go to kind of mobilize and engage the voters as we move forward in 2020. Texas is still a conservative state, but you saw Beto O'Rourke getting very close to beating Ted Cruz. You saw them gain in the House, in the state House at least, and of course the U.S. House and in the courts. I see people moving towards more progressive messages, but I also see more centrist messages sometimes winning in other parts of the country for Democrats. So from a Democratic perspective, let's talk about that and you kind of covered that, Matt, already from the Republican, but we'll talk a little bit more, take a deeper dive. Where do we need to go to mobilize in both parties to reach the most people and be effective? I'll let you start, Ed. Yeah.
Okay. Look, I think that we talked about this briefly before the panel starts, but I think for many years we've looked at the political spectrum like an arc, and that there's a far left and a far right, and there's a place in the middle. And I really think that is not the template that politics is built on anymore. If you look at what Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders had in common, is that they were able to just tap into things that people shared regardless of where they identified on the political spectrum. You had free trade, you had labor issues, you had a sense of straight talk and authenticity that really could fit on either side, and they drew people from both sides. It was weird that 2 people so diametrically opposed to each other could build such coalitions that had some parallels to them. So what I'm getting at is that I don't think that moderation is necessarily the what it used to be. I think that it's a matter of really dealing with people in a way where you say, I share your values. So for instance, if you're going to talk about public education, it's not how can we water down this policy to appease everybody, it's what are the values that we believe in with public education collectively. Now let's figure out what the solution is. Rather than somebody saying, I'm going to go to Washington, D.C. and work out a compromise on health care, you have someone say, I'm going to go to Washington, D.C. and I believe in the things you believe in health care. I'm going to fight for as hard for it as I can. However that resolves itself is however it resolves itself. In other words, they're not selling the process, they're selling the value. I think that's the same on both sides, and actually I think it's a bipartisan thing. I think, like Matt hit the nail on the head, they have to find an answer to health care. We have to find an answer to public education finance here in Texas. There's lots of issues that... Immigration, absolutely. Like, people complain about the problem, but they don't really find the solution. We can build a wall, but wall's not going to stop people who fly here and overstay their visas, which is 40% of the people who get here. So there are solutions that we have to seek out, but we have to sell the values that we're coming from in order to get to those solutions first.
Am I hearing that maybe there's more common ground between Republicans and Democrats than we think?
I think so, and I'm going to pick up on that point, Judy, in terms of both parties need to embrace diversity, and I don't mean diversity necessarily by race and ethnicity, but diversity in terms of ideology. So let me walk through 2 examples on the Democratic side. Alexandria Ocasio-Campo. Everybody's probably heard of her. She upset the longtime Democratic incumbent in New York. She is probably one of the furthest left members of Congress now that we've seen in recent times. And then we saw Beto O'Rourke, who is also a Democrat and a Democratic headliner, but had a very different message. And they both were very effective. Even though Beto didn't win, to me, coming in within 3 percentage points of Ted Cruz was a win for Beto. So they were both effective, one in New York, one here in Texas. And the Democratic Party needs to be okay with that and understand that Alexandria talks to her people in the Bronx and she resonates with them just like Beto resonates with Texans here. I would argue the same thing with the Republican Party. I'll defer to Matt on this, but there are Trump Republicans, there are Bush Republicans, there are Republicans in the middle, and that if you try to shoehorn a party into just one avenue, it's going to be chaos. We are a country of 2 big tent parties, and I think we have to allow for those distinct voices to come in, and I'll put the heavy lift on the leadership to let them hash it out in between.
Yeah, I think, look, the result, the net effect of all this is you can be pure up on Capitol Hill or in the Texas legislature, but the question is, are you getting anything done? And you know, I can make an argument that President Trump's gotten a lot done through the executive branch, but he's gotten almost nothing done through the legislative branch. Really, all he has is a tax cut to look to, and they used reconciliation to do that on a party line vote. And so I would probably have a slightly different take in the sense that I think both parties are moving to the outside, not to the 50-yard line. All the energy in the Democratic Party is on the progressive side right now. You're not seeing sort of Democratic Leadership Council, mainstream, pro-business Democrats rising anywhere. In fact, this presidential primary on the Democratic side, I think, is going to be a race to the left. And I would argue probably the same is true on the Republican side. We certainly have been moving to the right, and our energy's been on the conservative side. Now, a lot of that energy was in opposition to Obama. And Trump has, I will agree with Ed, I mean, Trump has created an interesting moment in politics in the sense that, you know, is he a conservative? Is he a Republican? Where are his views on the spectrum? It's hard to say. You know, a lot of Democrats generally in the past had said things on trade that are actually not that different from what Donald Trump has said. And it's actually, I think, maybe going to create an interesting moment in the new Congress. So the Democrats going to kind of continue along the lines of what they've said in the past on trade and agree with Trump? Or are they going to want to oppose him and go against some of their views? And so, you know, I would agree that I think if you can get to know someone in the other party, if you can sit down with them, you can see where you agree and try to work together and find consensus. I think that's what politics is about. It's about the art of the possible. But, you know, in Washington, it's hard to get things done. This White House is obviously pretty chaotic. And one of the challenges they have is that President Trump doesn't have consistent views on issues. He believes whatever he believes at the moment he says it. And so you don't really know kind of where they stand. It's hard to negotiate. It's hard to represent his views. I feel very badly for his spokespeople and his trade negotiators because he's kind of changing his views over time, and he likes having flexibility. So it creates problems. But I actually see the parties moving away from each other right now ideologically. You know, hopefully on big issues they can come together. I think in the new Congress, 2 opportunities for that will be infrastructure and drug pricing. Are some areas where they could find consensus and maybe get 60 votes. But I think we're going to get very little done over the next 2 years. We're going to have a big fight between Trump and Pelosi. Very little is going to get done, and before you know it, the presidential campaign is going to start. There's going to be 20 or 25 Democrats running, attacking Trump.
It's already started, I think.
Yeah, it's already.
Would you all agree with that analysis that both of the parties are moving to the sides, the far right and the far left, and that we're not going to probably get much done?
I think it depends. So I think in the House that may be the case, but I've been focusing a lot on the Western offensive by the part of the Democrats. So Beto O'Rourke, case in point, he didn't win, but he came close. Arizona, my native state, my home state of Arizona, we just saw Kyrsten Sinema, who is probably as moderate of a Democrat as you can get. Jackie Rosen in Nevada. So I think it maybe depends on the chamber. We're seeing the Senate Democrats moving to the middle. The Senate Republicans are a little bit different story, but I think there's variance, and we have to be careful in terms of making these generalizations that they're all hunkering down in their corner. It depends on what offices and also what region.
So would you agree with that? Because it is interesting that nationally we saw some of these, like in Arizona, these more moderate Democrats win in the Senate, but then we saw so many progressive candidates do well too. So what are your observations on that, Ed?
Well, look, everybody has to vote their district, and they have to vote the way their state wants them to vote. But I want to go back to what I said earlier about the landscape not necessarily being an arc anymore, and what we define as moderate or progressive or conservative. And I agree with Matt in that I think the parties are maybe going to their corners and getting more conservative and more progressive, but I don't agree that something that is progressive is not necessarily mainstream. So when you talk about the issue of student loan debt in this country, people can label that as a progressive issue. I would argue that it is a progressive issue that is very mainstream. I would say the same thing with covering pre-existing conditions through healthcare coverage is also a progressive issue that has become very mainstream. And when you pair that with something like a priority, which is to cut taxes for the wealthiest in this country, before you get to any of those issues, that sends a message to the electorate that you're not looking out for them. It goes back to what I was saying earlier. Do you share our values? Do you share our priorities? What would be the first thing you do? So I guess my answer is both. They're getting more conservative and more progressive, but we have to define, does more conservative or more progressive necessarily mean less mainstream? And I don't think it does.
Okay. I want to talk about the Latino vote because this was the vote that was courted so heavily, especially here in Texas. And from what I've read, actually young Latinos did a very good job of showing up at the polls, which hasn't always been the case. Where does the Latino vote fit in this picture since it's the fastest growing group in our country? And I guess, Victoria, you would probably be a good person to talk to about that.
Sure. So here in Texas, Latinos make up over 40% of the population. Nevertheless, they've consistently voted below that. Latinos in Texas and all across the nation have always been lagging in terms of the group with the lowest turnout rates. So what we have seen in the last couple of elections, and I think the 2018 did a really good job of putting a lot of resources into mobilizing the Latino community. There are a number of reasons why Latinos have lagged behind, which we can get into later. But so this is why we saw such a tremendous push in doing this. And we saw some fruit from that. I'm not going to say that they all came out in mass, but I have a statistic here. So a record 29 million Latinos turned out. So that's a 2% increase over the last midterm. And what we had been seeing is that Latino turnout had been declining in midterms over the last couple of years. So this is a huge deal for the Latino vote. When we talk about the Latino vote, I do always caution folks about this notion that demography is destiny. It depends. It depends where you are. So folks say, oh, as the Latino population grows in Texas, Texas is going to be blue. I say, whoa, wait a minute. First of all, we need to understand that Texas is a conservative state all around, and even among Latinos. Outside of Florida, Texas Latinos are the most likely to be Republican. So here in Texas, about 30% of Republicans voted Republican. During the George W. Bush administration, we had upwards of 45% Latinos voting Republican. So be careful when you say, oh, a growth in the Latino turnout, a growth in the Latino population is automatically going to mean a change. You have to understand what state you're talking about and how the candidates are approaching Latinos. So for example, right now with Trump and the Republican administration and the Texas rhetoric toward Latinos is rather harsh. So that's why we're seeing that 30%. It could grow. But at the same time, we see Democrats aggressively courting Latinos and trying to get them into the fold because, as I said earlier, once folks are voting, they will continue to vote. The average age of a Latino across the country is 18. The average age of a non-Hispanic white person, 46. So keep that in mind as we start looking forward into the elections about the potential that the Latino vote is going to have.
What does the Republican Party have to offer Latinos? Because I think that's such a good point. We can't paint a whole entire group of people with a broad brush and say Latinos are Democrats, because it's not true.
We've seen that Latinos, especially those here in Texas, tend to be more conservative on moral and religious reasons. Going back to the high water mark of the George W. Bush governorship and then a presidential administration, he really resonated with Latinos on that in terms of family, compassionate conservatism. And immigration matters to Latinos. It is one of the top concerns, but not the top concern. Healthcare, education, employment. I mean, Latinos are like everybody else. They want jobs, they want healthcare. Yeah. So immigration matters. Yes, you tend to have family members that may be undocumented or friends or distant relatives, but it's the rhetoric that really hurts the Republican Party when it comes to immigration. There's the issue, and both Democrats will say we need to find a solution to immigration, but when you're calling people, this week a recording came out of Representative Steve King from Iowa calling Mexicans dirt. That's what they are. So when you call people dirt, it's going to be hard for you to say, hey, come vote for my party. Even though you're dirt, come with me. So the rhetoric is really hurting them, because there is a section of the Latino community, just like any community, that may be a little bit more fiscally conservative or maybe a little bit moral and socially conservative, but there's that barrier of the harsh rhetoric and, quite frankly, the insulting
The community is not as monolithic as other communities, so that 1/3, 2/3 split's pretty common. It's probably better to look at Latino community by age than it is just simply by demographic, and I absolutely agree, demographics are not destiny. If you don't do the work, you won't get the win, period. So the problem in mobilizing the community over the years is that it's with any voter that doesn't show up. If a voter typically doesn't have a strong voter history, you're not going to invest a lot in getting that person to mobilize. That's changing. I think that's helpful. But something you said earlier about people getting, what was the word, the phrase you used? It wasn't outrage fatigue. It was
anxiety fatigue.
Anxiety fatigue. So something very similar in the Latino community is that you can't just be against the Republican Party. You got to give people a reason to come out and vote for the Democratic Party. And if you haven't shown up, and if you haven't said why you identify with those issues, then what's the incentive, whether it's the Latino community or any community for that matter?
Matt, do you want to weigh in on this one?
Absolutely. So, I said on Twitter just a couple days ago, it's time for the GOP to excommunicate Steve King. I've been critical of him for years, and only recently has some of this stuff really reached a different level. So, I think it's important for Republicans to be clear about what we believe, where we stand, what type of rhetoric is acceptable, and what type of rhetoric is not acceptable. And Steve King is in sort of that nationalist part of our party or our movement that's way out there on the fringe. And so I just want to make that clear. Look, I describe Hispanics as future Republicans. And that may be a little bit hopeful or rosy, but I truly believe that. And I say it because if you look at the Hispanic community, yes, in sort of a generalized way, they are disproportionately Catholic, disproportionately pro-life, disproportionately traditional family, disproportionately hardworking. They really do reflect the values that the Republican Party tries to put out there. For whatever reason, our party in the last 10 years has used rhetoric on immigration that continues to get more and more extreme. And I don't think Trump started that. Trump has taken it to a different level in recent years. He's been very focused on enforcing the law. Talks a lot about the wall. The wall is obviously not popular in South Texas along the border and in a lot of Hispanic communities. But I also don't believe that the Latino community wants rampant illegal immigration either, because I think that community understands how hard it is to come here legally and to wait your turn and to do it the right way. So, look, I think if you look at Texas, Beto did win the Hispanic vote as he should have. I think the margin was 30 or 35 points, but I think the net turnout among Hispanics in the Senate race was not where it needed to be. If he had really found a way to motivate Hispanics across the state, he might have had a chance to win the election. And if you look in the last couple of months, there were a lot of stories written about how there was a lack of intensity among Hispanic voters and even African American voters in Texas for Beto. Look, if you look in the past in Texas, Republican candidates have performed at a high level with Hispanics. Going back to George W. Bush, as she points out, but even much more recently with John Cornyn, Greg Abbott, you can go down the list. I know Abbott wanted to win the Latino vote this time. I think he didn't, but it was fairly close. So we've got to get to a point where we start competing at a much higher level nationally with the Hispanic vote. In Texas, we've done a pretty good job, mostly I think because proximity to Mexico, understanding the culture, the way we talk about immigration. Broadly, I think we've done a better job about that in Texas than we have nationally. But it's a challenge because in our primary, you have to be solid on immigration, and sometimes that is heard in ways that makes Hispanics think Republicans are racist, and that's a fundamental problem. Can you be strong on immigration in terms of enforcing the law, but talk about it in a way that doesn't convince a Hispanic that you're racist? That's a challenge for our party. It's been a challenge. It's going to continue to be a challenge, but we got to do a better job at it.
So I think that's the problem, is saying that you're solid on immigration in a Republican primary. What does that mean? And right now what it means is rhetoric that is alienating to the community. Yes, the community cares about legal immigration, comprehensive immigration reform, but to assume that everybody comes here is a criminal or all the things that Donald Trump said about the community is not only damaging, but you can talk about them as future Republicans, but I would refer to them as recovering Republicans, if you can use language like that. In 1994, I was at UCLA. California passed Prop 187, and it was the end of the California Republican Party. They are essentially a third party in California now because there is a hangover from Prop 187. The messages that the party sends to that community will linger. And I think that the Democratic Party has made strides. They've gone out and they've made efforts, not only to say that we believe in you, that we believe in what you're trying to do to build a better life, but we're fighting for the issues you care about. Until the rhetoric changes, it doesn't matter what the policy is. People react to how you make them feel.
I want to get to audience questions. This is called Engage Breakfast for a reason, so we'd love to know what questions you have for our panel members.
Okay. So I'm not really seeing any themes, but there is a question regarding the younger voice. How can the parties engage younger people and first-time voters?
They certainly get them registered. I mean, in
Right.
Travis County, we have more
But
young voters registered, but keep them engaged and get them to the polls.
Right. And make them have allow them to have representation in the party.
Young voters, let's talk about that.
I think the first step is defining what a young voter is, right? If you're under 50 and you're a voter, you're pretty young. And that's the reality. 50% is actually, I think 50% was under 50 in this last election, was actually the highest.
Right.
Right? That the 50-year mark was the halfway point. But when we start talking about issues that people care about, and again, I'm going to go back to student loan debt, and housing is another big issue. You talk about those issues, those resonate with people. They feel those, they understand them, they know what they mean. Typically, the biggest sign of whether or not someone is going to vote is if they are a homeowner or if they have kids. I think that is changing because I think our world is changing. I think people are starting homes later. I think they're starting families later. I think they're buying homes later. A lot of that is related to cost. They can't afford to buy a home sooner. They can't afford to start a family sooner. If we talk about the issues that resonate with people, and I'm actually, student loan debt's not one of my big issues, but it's come up a lot today because I think it's an important one that isn't addressed often enough, but something that everybody feels every month. And so long as issues like that are in the conversation, I think we're going to mobilize people to vote.
So I'm going to come at it from a different perspective, which is I think we need to get younger folks to run for office.
Yeah.
You see who represents you, and when they don't look like you at all, you don't feel very engaged. So I think that if both parties and different organizations that are those pipeline programs for getting women and people in general to run can do a little bit more in terms of recruiting young folks to run. I'm not saying, if you're 25, 26, I don't know how old you have to be to run for the Senate, but start with school board, start with city council, start with local level elections, and I think that is a very good way to engage people just by having that mirror that looks like you.
Start with learning leadership skills at Leadership Austin.
Exactly, right there.
Matt, you want to talk about the youth vote?
Yeah, look, I think it's to be candid. Republicans have not done a good job mobilizing, connecting with, and identifying young voters. I do think that's changing slowly. There are, Students for Life is one of the largest and fastest growing groups in the country. Kristen Hawkins does a great job running that group on campuses around the country. College Republicans have a presence on most campuses. Young Conservatives of Texas have a presence on campuses in Texas. Turning Point USA, which is a group that's very, very rapidly growing as well. But, look, I think Democrats, the Democratic Party really focuses on young voters. They focus on registering people on college campuses. They focus on turning them out, on making sure they're early voting in election day locations. And I think it's part of the reason why Travis County and Hayes County went the Democratic direction this cycle to the extent they did, was University of Texas and Texas State. And so we need to do a better job with it. There's no question about it. I think if the older you are as a voter, the more reliable you are, right? Seniors vote at a very, very, very high level. And I think so as you look at how do you build a path to victory, you don't start with the youth vote if you're a Republican. You're going to get probably a pretty small share to begin with, and they're very unreliable voters. If they become more reliable, then they're going to become more of a factor. They're going to have more influence. So it's certainly something to watch. But in midterm elections, youth voters generally don't turn out. I think they probably did this time more so than they have in the past, and that'll be an interesting trend to watch going forward.
I want to talk about women. Women ran in record numbers. It started all with the Women's March, and a lot of people realized, if I really want to make my voice heard, I need to run for office. And I think I read a statistic that 40% of the women who ran for office nationally, locally, if you look at it across the board, 40% won. So how will that change the dynamics? When more women have a seat at the table. I mean, Congress is only 23% women right now, and that's changing. So how will that change the conversations? I like to think, maybe I'm generalizing, but I like to think women are better at building consensus and listening, but maybe I'm generalizing. Sorry, guys.
No, there's actually research that supports
Okay, good. Thank you.
Judy, if I could take first stab
Yeah.
at this, near and dear to my heart. So 1992 was the original year of the woman when we saw record numbers of women come into Congress and elected offices. In this last electoral cycle, we saw a record number of women throw their hat in the ring for all levels of offices, which is the good news. The not so good news is that we didn't see as many of these women win. The Senate numbers are still the same. In Congress, a slight uptick, governors about the same. But for me, the bigger picture is that women ran, which means they've kind of got that hunger now. One of my favorite movies, and this is super cheesy, is Talladega Nights. Ricky Bobby says, if you're not first, you're last. But no, not in this case, Ricky Bobby. Because the fact that women ran and they came, and it was so close in so many of these races. Look at Stacey Abrams in Georgia, MJ Hager here in Texas. John Carter, the last election he ran, he beat his Democratic opponent by 20 percentage points. She came within 3 percentage points. So you go down the line of all of these races where women came so close, and that is going to continue on. And then in terms of what that means once they're at the table, once they're in office, we do know from research in Women in Politics that women, both Republicans and Democrats, tend to look at issues that deal a lot more with the welfare of the family. Education, healthcare. How can we make the lives of individuals on a day-to-day basis better, and also tending to be a little bit more conciliatory? So for me, even though maybe at first sight you might say, well, women didn't do as great as we thought with all that noise around this election, my argument to you is that they actually did, and just keep your eyes on 2020 and beyond.
And we finally have 2 Native American women, a Muslim woman. There's voices that haven't been heard in Congress
Here
before.
in Texas, we elected the first 2 Latina women. I mean, it was embarrassing.
Yeah.
We are the state with the second largest Latino population, and we had never sent a Latina to Congress. Now we have Sylvia Garcia and Veronica Escobar there for Somali American women in Congress, 2 Native American women. New Mexico just elected its second woman as governor. So you have back-to-back women. Susanna Martinez was a Republican. Now we have Michelle Lujan Grisham. That's awesome. You usually think of like, okay, men are always succeeding each other. Now in New Mexico, we're seeing women succeed each other.
Yeah, while we're talking about breaking barriers, I would also mention Pete Flores, who I, in full disclosure, helped become the first Hispanic Republican to serve in the state Senate. He was elected in a special election in September. But on the issue of women, there's no question that that more of them ran than ever. I think a lot of that has to do with the Women's March and a dedicated, focused effort that particularly Democrats have spent to recruit those candidates. Look, I think if you look at elections, generally female candidates in general elections in Texas get a benefit if they're running against a man. It's along the margins, but it does matter. And, you know, look, I think having worked for a female elected official when I worked for Senator Kay Bailey Hutchinson as her press secretary, I can tell you that in the U.S. Senate, the women are more constructive. They're less partisan. They work together. The female senators get together once a month for kind of a social gathering, and they have real ties, real bonds, and real friendships. They don't attack each other, and they work together, and they really do. And they want to help each other. They want to see each other succeed. They want to see each other stay there. They want to see the number of women increase. And so, you know, I know it's easy to generalize, and it's sometimes cheap to offer these kinds of compliments of the female gender, but I do think it's real in legislating. I think that's true at the state legislative level as well. On R or D side, they generally are, as I said, more problem solvers, more consensus builders, more focused.
And it seems like we need that now more than ever. I mean, there's the divisiveness is so great in our country.
And whether it's women or communities of color, the reality in politics is that power is not given away, it's taken away. And the only way that's going to happen is for people to step up and run. And with all due respect to John F. Kennedy, you cannot wait for the torch to be passed. You have to reach out, you have to grab it, and you have to run like hell.
Courtney, are there some other questions from the audience?
Yes. Can you all comment on voter suppression? Is it real or used as a distraction to prevent potential voters from voting? And particularly Hays County restrictions as well.
They don't have an extended early voting period, I believe, like Travis County does in Hays County. This seems to be an issue that comes up in Texas a lot because we're not as advanced technologically. We don't take advantage of some of the technological advances to get people to register, to get them to the polls. Go ahead, Ed. You start with that one. I see the brain turning, those little wheels
where
turning.
to begin, right? So, like, let's start with Harris County, where early vote ended on 4:30 during the first week of early vote because they weren't legally required to make it go till 7 o'clock until the second week. That's ridiculous. The Hays County thing, they had polling places on the on the campus of Texas State, and they shut them down after 2 days. Why? You had lines out the door. Why are you stopping people from voting? Voter ID, we could talk about that all day. You can use a gun license to vote. You can't use a student ID to vote. I mean, come on, right? If we can agree that voting rights are paramount to a democracy, then we should agree that access to the polls is important. And yes, you want to protect the vote. You want to make sure that it's a legitimate vote. But you want to make it equally protective for everybody, not easier for some and harder for others. So it's a problem in this state. I have my beliefs. I think it's because Republicans haven't really grown their vote haul in this state in 12 years. That changed a little bit on Tuesday, but prior to that, they had picked up 150,000 votes in 12 years. That is a small margin for the fastest growing state in America. Over the same period, Democrats picked up 1 million votes. How do you protect your majority? You limit the vote. Again, my opinion, I'm sure Matt has a different opinion on that.
Yeah, I mean, every single Republican statewide official got more votes than Beto O'Rourke did. You know, Beto got more votes than Hillary did. And so that's a reflection of the strength of his campaign, the fact he had $80 million that he raised, the most that any Senate candidate in the history of the country's ever raised. You know, yeah, I would strongly disagree with a lot of what Ed said. I mean, a gun license is a government document. A campus ID is not a government document. You have to have a government-issued ID to do many things in life. To get government benefits. Are government benefits racist because you have to have a photo ID? How are you supposed to prove who you are if you don't have a photo ID? The photo ID law has been upheld at every challenge and now is a law of the land, and we haven't seen a large number of people say they could not either get a photo ID or get an official state identification if they didn't have a driver's license. I'm interested in whatever smart ways there are to make it easier for people to vote legally. I'm very, very interested in that. We actually have pretty decent opportunities in Texas. 2 weeks of early vote, including a weekend. People can vote by mail if they're over 65. If they're under 65, they have to provide a reason. We had pretty high turnout this time, so if Republicans were suppressing the vote, we did a very poor job. So again, I mean, I'm interested in what the law is. You have to obey the law. You have to execute the law. I will say one last thing. The counties themselves have real challenges holding these votes, just from a logistics standpoint. As the county chair here in Travis, I can tell you Travis County was overwhelmed. And I wish we would get to better systems where we could get faster results, where we had less questions about what the results are, or when we're going to know who won, or when the vote can be certified. So I think there's a different partisan view on this between the two parties on the issue of voter suppression. If you don't like the system, change the law. That's what you should do. And I actually think one thing I will say, and it's not really about voter suppression, but we are going to have a very significant improvement in Texas elections in 2020. Straight ticket voting will be over. And so mindless voting will be over. You'll have to go to each race and choose which person you want to vote for. And so if you don't know who's running for district court judge and wherever you live, maybe you don't vote in that race. If you want to vote for everybody in one party, you have to physically go through and do it. And so I think the net effect of that is it's going to help Republicans in urban areas, it's going to help Democrats in rural areas, and it's going to be a jump ball in competitive suburban areas.
I want to say I did misspeak about Hays County. I think the issue in Hays County is that you have to vote in your precinct, unlike Travis County where you can vote.
I think that's most counties, though.
Yeah, you can vote anywhere at early vote in Travis County, but on election day you have to vote at your location.
Actually, I think in
No,
Travis
no,
County
no,
you can
not
vote
in Travis
anywhere.
County.
Yeah.
In Travis County, you can vote anywhere
But I
on
think we're the
election
only
day.
one.
I think that's
Yeah,
the early vote.
but in other counties,
Williamson?
yeah, Williamson and Travis, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, are two where you can vote at any precinct on election day. But in the other outlying counties, you have to go to your precinct on election day.
Here's a question I have. Why does early vote have to end? Why can't it just go straight to election day?
I have a question. Well, what about just as big as an obstacle, perhaps, is registration? So
Yeah.
why not same-day registration?
Or online?
Or online registration, like
online
they do in other
registration.
states.
Yeah.
And let me play the partisan Switzerland here and give a little bit of historical context. The United States is one of the only countries in the world that has this weird Tuesday voting. In most countries, the day that you vote is a holiday, or it's a weekend. It's almost like a national holiday. And I mean, the reason we vote on the Tuesday in November, the first Tuesday in November, is because when we were an agricultural society, the crops, you had to wait till the crops were done, and then you had to travel by horse and buggy to your county seat, which had to be after going to church on Sunday, so you had one day to go back and forth. That's why it's that first Tuesday of November, and we are no longer an agricultural society or a horse and buggy society. So I think we need to rethink our registration and our voting systems given that.
I'm not a fan of the election day holiday thing. As much as I am for opening access to voting, I think election day holiday having everybody vote on one day would be like asking everybody to buy their Christmas presents on one day. And I think the logistics of it would be a problem. I would actually like to see online voter registration, early vote that goes straight through election day, being able to vote at any polling place in your county. I think that there are ways that we can make it sort of like a 3-week festivus of elections.
Festivus.
But also employers. I mean, employers need to be understanding when people need to take off to vote. And I believe there's something in the state law that
Yes.
says they're
You
supposed
have
to
to
do
give
that.
time off.
But I'm not sure most employers do that. No?
It depends on the employer. Like if you're working in a business or in a law
My
firm.
employer does.
Yeah, you can
Kayla,
come and
you
go.
does. But
But if you work in minimum wage jobs, maybe like technically your manager would give you time off, but he's already kind of disgruntled and mean and crotchety. Do you really want to go? And this is the job that's helping you pay your rent. So I mean, there are just so many issues here that I think we can all do a better job of rethinking how voting works in our democracy.
But it will take a change in the law, as you said,
Absolutely.
Matt, right? Here in Texas. And I don't see that coming anytime soon.
Yeah, and it's county by county, and I think, I don't know, I'm just not all that sensitive to the argument that, you give someone, 14 days of early voting, starting at 7 a.m., ending at 7 p.m., including both days on the weekend, and yet they can't turn out they can't find time to vote. They can't make it work on their schedule. They have 2 full weeks. I think the counties themselves don't want early voting to continue, and the county election offices don't want them to continue because they have to transition from early vote to election day, and you have a much larger number of voting locations that are open on election day. So I think it's really a logistical challenge. Look, I mean, we all are critical, I think, of county election offices, but they have very limited resources. They're overworked. It's very intense for them the last 3 weeks of any election. And I think we have to be mindful of what they're truly able to do as much as what the ideas are to make things better.
Yeah, a tip of the hat to Bruce Elfont for managing the volume of stuff that came through in this last election.
Yeah. Bruce is often an attender at Leadership Austin Breakfast. We have time for one more audience question if you have one, Courtney.
Yes. What tools or activities can people do to research the candidates and community issues impacting them?
I always say League of Women Voters Guide.
I know. I was.
Yeah, but anybody else want to weigh in?
I mean, I think one of the challenges is a lot of voters don't know who their member of Congress is. They don't know who their state senator is. They don't know who their state rep is. So it starts with just understanding, what districts are you in, who's on your ballot, who represents you now, do you have an opinion of the work they've done, and then figuring out who's running against them, seeing who's qualified. I think, a third of the country's Republican, a third of the country's Democratic, and the rest are in the middle, and they kind of go back and forth. And so I think the tools are out there. I think it would be kind of hard to not be able to find what you want to find about candidates. It would require very minimal effort. Obviously, candidate websites themselves have information. I agree, League of Women Voters is a great site. There are others, Ballotpedia and other sites that kind of take views that candidates have for particular offices. There's obviously more information for candidates at the federal level and at the statewide level. Local candidates, that can be more of a challenge. I know during the election, I got a lot of questions. Who are you recommending for ASD board? Who are you recommending for ACC? Who are you, local city councils, things like that. I think that there's probably a need for better information about those candidates, what their qualifications are, what they want to do. There's
and
a challenge at the local level.
propositions and all those
Propositions
things
as well.
that, all
Absolutely.
politics is local, so those are really the most important things you vote on.
I think I would take a more narrow focus to it, actually. People look at politics like it's the stock market. They don't know where to begin. It's overwhelming, so they just don't. And what you need to do is, for people who are new to the process or just entering the process, find out what you care about most. Do you care about LGBTQ equality? Well, then find out who the LGBTQ equality organization recommends, and then build out from there. Then go to Ballotpedia and League of Women Voters. Do you care about public education? See what the Teachers Association is saying, or see what a student association is saying. Find out what you care about the most. Find the organization that is advocating for candidates. Really, it's if you care about that issue, you should probably be involved in that organization to begin with. I think too often we look at elections as the beginning and end of our democratic process, when really it's just a part of it, right? The legislative process is a part of it, and activism is a big part of that. And democracy is like a muscle, and if you don't exercise it, it will get weak. So find out the organizations you care about based on the issues you care about, build out from there. And then Ballotpedia, like I said, Ballotpedia and League of Women Voters are great places to go.
And that is the perfect segue to our call to action. So I would love for each of you to tell this audience, and these are a bunch of engaged people already, but how can we get even more engaged and encourage others to get engaged throughout the process, not just, as you said, on election day, but get involved on these issues, educate themselves, educate other people in the community. So that will be our call to action today for each of you.
Find the thing you care about most and get involved. Progress Texas is an organization that fights for lots of progressive issues, but I really care about homeless and hunger issues. I'm involved with Caritas. I give money to them every month. I don't do nearly as much as I would like to do with them, but that's something that I care about, and I'm sure there are issues you care about too. That's a great way to start.
Victoria?
Get uncomfortable. So I want to talk about our deep partisan divisions. And we know that when you have interpersonal contact with somebody who's different than you on whatever level, race, ethnicity, gender, partisanship, that after that interaction, even though it's uncomfortable, you come away with a more positive view of that person. So if you are a Republican, find a Democrat and just have a conversation, start talking about issues, if vice versa. But I think we need to get out of our safe spaces because it's very easy to live in a political or ideological bubble. Get uncomfortable is my call to action.
Yeah, I mean, the country's becoming more tribal. I think it's a bad thing, more polarized. I think media is affecting that. I think Trump's affecting that. I think a lot of things are affecting that. Yeah, I mean, my advice wouldn't be all that different. I would say that, as I said before, I think getting to know who your elected officials are, who represent you, is a very easy thing to do, actually, if you put some effort into it. Follow them, sign up for their email updates, see what they're doing, get engaged directly with them. You know, a lot of people say they hate politics, and I understand why. I mean, having worked in it for 15 years, there's a lot about it that's very unappealing. But what I would say is politics isn't everything. It affects every part of your life in some way. And so if you hate politics, you're actually sort of minimizing your own ability to affect democracy and affect our republic. And so it doesn't matter what industry you work in, there's a trade association somewhere that represents you. Get involved with them. You probably have your company or some other group probably is a member already, or you can become a member. And then at least you can get involved up at the Texas Capitol during the legislative session, testify on legislation, make sure that the legislature doesn't make your job or your industry worse. That's a really easy way to get involved. You'll get to know you're a member of the city council. If you're frustrated about property taxes or traffic or affordability or whatever issues you know, that you're worried about, get to know you're a member of the city council. They need people to apply for boards and commissions from their districts. And so go on their site and apply. You know, go on the governor's site and apply for an appointment if that interests you. There are so many ways to get involved, and I agree with Ed. Nonprofit you know, activities are available to everyone, and there are so many nonprofits in Austin. They all need help. They need board members. They need people who do events. They need you know, financial support. There's an overwhelming number of opportunities out there. I think again, it's about finding out what you're passionate about, what you're interested in, what will sustain that interest over time. Whether it's politics or not, I think saying, I hate politics, I'm not going to get involved, really closes a door to you that really is wide open if you choose to walk through it.
Matt Makoviak, Victoria DeFrancesco Soto, Ed Espinosa, thank you for sharing your insight with us and some great takeaways on the 2018 midterms. We will see everyone on December 12th. We hope you can make it. There's a new study on child care in Central Texas, which is such an important issue in so many families, and we're going to have a great discussion about child care December the 12th. Thanks for caring enough to be here this morning. Go out and make it a wonderful day and enjoy the sunshine.